When we think about discipline, we tend to imagine someone forcing themselves to do something they don't want to do, grinding through the resistance, ignoring distractions, and powering forward through sheer will. But that's a misconception. True discipline isn't about moment-to-moment willpower. It's about establishing internal systems, neurological systems, that make consistent action feel more automatic and less effortful. In other words, it's about training the brain to support discipline from the inside out. Willpower is a limited resource. It's mediated by the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for executive functions like decision-making, planning, and impulse control. But the prefrontal cortex is susceptible to fatigue. It can be easily overrun by stress, emotional reactivity, and low energy states. That's why trying to use willpower to power through every challenge is often a losing battle. The brain wasn't designed to rely on constant top-down control for every behavior. Instead, the goal is to build a brain that defaults to disciplined behavior. That happens when you create environmental conditions and daily habits that shape how key neurochemical systems like dopamine, norepinephrine, and cortisol operate over time. These systems influence whether your brain is in a state of readiness and follow through or in a state of avoidance and reactivity. Let's take dopamine as an example. Dopamine isn't just the molecule of reward, it's the molecule of motivation, drive, and forward action. When your baseline dopamine levels are healthy and well regulated, you're more likely to pursue challenging goals and delay gratification. But when that system is dysregulated, when you're constantly chasing quick dopamine hits from social media, junk food, or novelty, you blunt your ability to focus and pursue. Discipline suffers not because you lack willpower, but because your brain's chemistry is out of alignment with the demands of disciplined behavior. Training the brain for discipline means building daily habits that optimize this chemistry. That includes sleep, physical movement, exposure to natural light, hydration, and structured task engagement. These aren't just lifestyle tips, they are levers that shift the internal state of your brain. When these inputs are consistent, your neural circuits for focus and action get stronger. The brain adapts. The prefrontal cortex communicates more effectively with the basal ganglia and limbic system. This is what neuroscientists refer to as top-down regulation. And it doesn't require force, it requires consistency. Over time, the behavior that once felt difficult becomes easier because the brain has literally rewired itself to prefer it. You begin to crave structure. You experience less friction between intention and execution. You don't have to fight yourself to do what you said you were going to do. The task might still be hard, but your relationship to the effort changes. So discipline isn't about muscling your way through resistance every single day. It's about shaping your brain's environment, chemistry, and structure so that doing the hard thing becomes the default, not the exception. That's not just a mindset shift, it's a biological shift, one that's completely trainable. Morning sunlight exposure is not just a wellness trend. It is a foundational trigger for setting in motion the neurobiological systems that control your ability to stay disciplined throughout the day. This one habit acts like a master switch, flipping on the internal clock of the brain and body, aligning hormone release, increasing mental clarity, and most importantly, enhancing your capacity to engage in focused, goal-directed behavior. Here's how it works. When you wake up and expose your eyes to natural sunlight, ideally within the first 30 to 60 minutes of waking, specialized cells in your retina called intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells detect that light. These cells are not involved in vision. They're wired directly to a part of the brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or SCN. The SCN is the master circadian clock. Its job is to synchronize all of the body's physiological processes to the external light-dark cycle. This matters because the SCN sends downstream signals to regulate cortisol, the hormone associated with alertness and readiness. Cortisol gets a bad rap, but in the morning, a healthy spike in cortisol is what wakes you up, primes your brain for attention, and sets the rhythm for your energy levels throughout the day. When that spike happens at the right time, triggered by natural light, you get a clear signal to your brain and body that it's time to be awake, alert, and focused. That alertness is not just a feeling. It's supported by the activation of the locus ceruleus, a small nucleus in the brainstem that releases norepinephrine, a neurochemical involved in vigilance, attention, and mental drive. Light in the early part of the day activates this pathway, which in turn sharpens your ability to engage in tasks that require sustained effort and delayed gratification. Core components of discipline, but it doesn't stop there. Morning sunlight exposure also anchors the timing of your dopamine system. Dopamine is the key player in motivation and goal pursuit. Light exposure helps regulate the pulse of dopamine that should rise during the early part of the day and taper as the day goes on. This supports a steady drive toward effortful action as opposed to the erratic peaks and crashes that come from poor light exposure and overstimulation. If you delay this exposure by staying indoors, staring at screens, or using artificial lighting, you send confusing signals to these systems. You flatten your cortisol rhythm, dampen dopamine tone, and reduce the coherence of your circadian clock. That can lead to sluggishness, impulsivity, difficulty concentrating, and a general sense that everything requires more effort than it should. The science is clear. Early light exposure is not optional if you want your brain to perform at its highest level. It's a keystone habit, meaning it supports and stabilizes other habits. When you lock in morning light exposure, you regulate your internal state in a way that makes discipline feel natural. You're not pushing against your biology, you're aligning with it. And when your biology is in sync, discipline becomes something you can rely on day after day. The first hour after you wake up is a biological window of opportunity. What you do during this time sends powerful signals to your brain and body, and among the most important of those signals is light. Not just any light, natural light from the sun. When light enters your eyes shortly after waking, it triggers a chain reaction in your nervous system that sets your internal clock. This isn't just about knowing what time it is. It's about calibrating the rhythms of your brain and body to function at their peak, especially when it comes to alertness, focus, and impulse control. Here's what's happening under the surface. In your retina, at the back of your eyes, there are specialized cells that don't contribute to vision but are incredibly sensitive to light, particularly blue light, which is most abundant in the early part of the day. These cells, called melanopsin, containing ganglion cells, detect light and send electrical signals directly to a part of the brain known as the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or SCN. The SCN is your circadian pacemaker. It governs the timing of virtually every physiological and behavioral process in your body. Sleep-wake cycles, hormone release, body temperature, metabolism, and even mood regulation. When light hits your SCN early in the day, it resets your internal clock to align with the external world. This is essential because the brain evolved to function on a 24-hour light-dark cycle. Without that anchor, without that early light input, your internal systems drift, and you lose synchronization between key neural circuits that control alertness and self-regulation. One of the immediate effects of properly timed morning light is the stimulation of a healthy cortisol pulse. Cortisol, often misunderstood, is not inherently a stress hormone. In the early morning, it plays a vital role in waking the brain up, sharpening focus and preparing the body for action. That rise in cortisol is supposed to happen naturally, and it's triggered by bright light. When this pulse is absent or delayed, like when you stay in the dark, wear sunglasses, or rely solely on indoor lighting, you blunt this alerting signal. The result? Grogginess, procrastination, and poor cognitive control. Just as critical is the downstream effect on the prefrontal cortex, the area of the brain involved in planning, impulse suppression, and goal tracking. When your circadian clock is aligned, your prefrontal cortex functions more efficiently. You're better able to delay gratification, resist temptations, and make high-quality decisions. When it's misaligned, those abilities break down. That's not a character flaw, it's biology. So when we say that morning light sets your internal clock, we're also saying it sets your brain's capacity for discipline. It regulates the hormones and neural circuits that govern whether you feel energized or distracted, decisive or reactive. Missing that light in the first hour of waking doesn't just make you tired, it compromises your ability to control behavior. And over time, that erosion of impulse control compounds into poor habits and underperformance. Getting outside, exposing your eyes to the sky, even on a cloudy day, is one of the simplest, most powerful ways to enhance discipline by optimizing your biology. It's not a luxury. It's a biological necessity. Natural morning light is one of the most potent regulators of your neurochemical state, particularly when it comes to cortisol and dopamine, two critical players in sustained motivation and discipline. Most people underestimate how deeply light exposure influences the brain. This isn't just about feeling more awake, it's about setting the baseline conditions that allow you to stay focused, resist distractions, and push through effortful tasks consistently throughout the day. When natural sunlight enters the eyes early in the morning, ideally within the first 30 to 60 minutes after waking, it activates a set of retinal cells that send signals directly to the brain's master clock, located in the suprachiasmatic nucleus, SCN, of the hypothalamus. This clock doesn't just regulate sleep, it sets the cadence for hormone release, neurotransmitter activity, and overall mental and physical readiness. One of the first and most crucial things it does is trigger a rise in cortisol. Cortisol, often misunderstood, isn't just the stress hormone. In the right context and at the right time, especially in the morning, it acts as a powerful alerting signal. It helps you transition from sleep inertia to full wakefulness. But more than that, it sets in motion a cascade of biochemical events that support cognition, immune function, and energy metabolism. Natural light exposure ensures that this cortisol pulse is robust and timed correctly, anchoring your alertness rhythm for the entire day. Without that life signal, cortisol may spike later or not at all. And when that happens, your energy, mood, and focus are compromised. You're left trying to push through the day without the very neurochemical fuel your brain was designed to rely on. At the same time, morning light also plays a key role in modulating dopamine, the molecule responsible for motivation, reward anticipation, and effort. Dopamine release is tightly coupled to circadian rhythms. When you get sunlight in the early part of the day, it helps establish a healthy rise in dopamine tone. That's not a dopamine spike like you'd get from a sudden reward. It's a stable elevation of baseline dopamine levels. That steady tone supports drive, goal-directed behavior, and long-term motivation. This is critical because dopamine isn't just about feeling good, it's about wanting. When your dopamine system is functioning well, you're more likely to pursue hard goals without needing external rewards every step of the way. You engage in effort not because you're chasing a quick payoff, but because your brain is set up to find effort itself rewarding. That's the biological foundation of discipline. So when you expose yourself to natural light in the morning, you're not just waking up. You're calibrating your brain. You're aligning your cortisol for alertness and your dopamine for motivation. And once those systems are in sync, you stop needing willpower to get started. The drive is there. The energy is there. You're not forcing discipline. You're building it into your biology. The prefrontal cortex is the command center of discipline. It's the part of your brain responsible for planning, decision-making, delaying gratification, and regulating impulses. When you say, I should do this, even though I don't feel like it, that thought comes from the prefrontal cortex. And the strength of this brain region, its ability to maintain control over your behaviors and emotions, can be trained. One of the most powerful yet often overlooked ways to do that is through the habit of consistent morning sunlight exposure. When you step outside in the first hour after waking and allow natural light to enter your eyes, you activate several brain systems all at once. One of the most important effects is the resetting of your circadian clock, which directly influences the functioning of the prefrontal cortex. A properly timed circadian rhythm allows this brain region to operate at peak performance during the hours when you need focus, willpower, and executive control. What's happening is both electrical and chemical. Light exposure helps trigger the early day rise of cortisol, an essential alerting hormone, and supports the healthy cycling of neurotransmitters like dopamine and norepinephrine. These neurochemicals act like fuel for the prefrontal cortex. They enhance your ability to weigh consequences, override urges, and choose actions that align with long-term goals rather than short-term comfort. The opposite is also true. If your circadian system is out of sync because you delay light exposure, stay indoors in dim lighting, or disrupt your sleep-wake cycle, your prefrontal cortex suffers. You're more likely to operate from subcortical areas of the brain like the amygdala and striatum, which are reactive, emotional, and driven by immediate gratification. This is when discipline breaks down. You know what you should do, but you can't seem to make yourself do it. This is when the neural circuits involved in sustained attention and behavioral inhibition. With consistent exposure, you're sending a powerful signal to your brain. This is when the day begins. This is when focus turns on, and this is when goal-directed behavior is expected. Over time, that repetition strengthens synaptic connections in the prefrontal cortex. This is neuroplasticity in action. The brain's ability to rewire itself based on experience. And what's fascinating is that this doesn't just improve momentary focus. It upgrades your behavioral patterns over time. People who consistently anchor their mornings with sunlight tend to report fewer impulse-driven decisions, more clarity around goals, and a greater sense of internal control. They don't rely as heavily on motivation because their prefrontal systems are engaged and active by default. This isn't about trying harder. It's about creating a brain state where trying isn't necessary for basic follow-through. When the prefrontal cortex is well-fueled, well-synchronized, and well-trained, discipline becomes less of a struggle and more of a reflex. And that transformation begins with a simple, repeatable habit: getting natural light in your eyes shortly after waking. Your brain is a timing machine. It operates on a circadian rhythm, a roughly 24-hour cycle that governs everything from alertness and mood to hormone secretion and behavioral control. And the single most important input for setting that internal clock is light. Not just any light, natural light from the sun. When you start your day in artificial light or darkness, you interfere with this delicate system. You send confusing or delayed signals to your brain, and that disruption directly impacts your capacity for discipline. Let's break this down. In the first hour after waking, your brain is looking for environmental cues to determine what time it is. It needs a strong signal to initiate the proper hormonal and neurochemical sequence for wakefulness, focus, and behavioral regulation. When natural sunlight enters your eyes, particularly rich in blue light wavelengths in the early part of the day, it activates a specialized group of cells in your retina. These cells communicate directly with the suprachiasmatic nucleus, SCN, the brain's central clock. This clock then orchestrates the daily rhythm of cortisol, dopamine, body temperature, and more. If, instead, you remain in a dim indoor environment or rely solely on artificial light, especially the soft, low-lux lighting found in most homes, you miss that critical signal. The SCN doesn't get the information it needs. As a result, cortisol, the hormone that helps wake the brain and increase alertness, either rises too late or doesn't spike robustly. Without that early surge, your energy levels remain low, your focus is scattered, and your prefrontal cortex, the brain region responsible for decision-making and self-control, functions below its potential. Worse, if you stay in darkness or scroll through your phone in bed under low lighting, your brain may not even recognize that the day has begun. This delays the start of your circadian rhythm and shifts your entire biological schedule forward. Your alertness, mood, and motivation come online later in the day, and that leaves your mornings vulnerable to procrastination and impulsivity. Tasks that require effort and follow-through become much harder to initiate, not because you're weak, but because your neurobiology isn't primed for action. Even bright artificial lighting indoors typically lacks the intensity of natural sunlight. On a clear day, outdoor light ranges from 10,000 to over 100,000 lux. Indoor lighting, by comparison, often falls below 1,000 lux. That's a massive difference in signal strength. Your brain is sensitive to this. It interprets low-intensity light as a weak or ambiguous cue, leading to a sluggish cortisol rhythm, unstable dopamine signaling, and fragmented attention. These conditions set the stage for emotional reactivity, poor planning, and decreased willpower, all of which erode discipline. So when we talk about the habit of morning light exposure, we're not just talking about optimizing mood or sleep. We're talking about the foundational input your brain needs to perform the executive functions that discipline relies on. Without that input, or with a poor substitute, your biological systems drift out of sync, and you find yourself reacting to life instead of taking control of it. That's not a motivational issue. That's a systems failure, and it starts with what kind of light hits your eyes at the beginning of the day. You don't need to overhaul your life to change your brain. One of the most powerful levers for enhancing discipline and motivation is deceptively simple: getting outside and letting natural light hit your eyes. Just for 5 to 10 minutes in the early part of the day. That short exposure is enough to trigger a neural cascade that optimizes your brain's chemistry for focus, impulse control, and sustained effort. It's not about the duration, it's about the timing and intensity of the signal. Here's what's happening. When natural light, particularly the blue enriched wavelengths present in early daylight, enters your eyes, it stimulates specialized cells in the retina called intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. These cells aren't involved in seeing images. Instead, they act like timekeepers. They send direct signals to the brain's master circadian clock located in the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or SCN, which sits in the hypothalamus. The SCN then synchronizes dozens of biological systems throughout the body and brain, from hormone release to body temperature to neurotransmitter regulation. That 5 to 10 minute window of light is enough to reset the SCN and anchor your circadian rhythm. And once that clock is set, the rest of your day unfolds in a more orderly and productive biological rhythm. One of the first responses to this early light input is a timed increase in cortisol levels. This is not stress cortisol. This is your body's natural wake-up signal. It sharpens attention, increases energy, and promotes mental clarity. You feel more ready to take on the day, not because you willed yourself into alertness, but because your brain was chemically prepared for it. At the same time, this brief light exposure initiates a rise in dopamine. Dopamine is the neuromodulator that drives motivation, goal-directed behavior, and the willingness to exert effort. Importantly, this early rise isn't a spike. It's a steady increase in baseline dopamine levels throughout the day. That matters because higher baseline dopamine makes you more likely to engage in challenging but meaningful tasks without needing constant external rewards. In other words, you become more intrinsically motivated. This is the foundation of real discipline. What's remarkable is how little time it takes to set this system in motion. On a clear day, even 5 minutes outside is often enough. On cloudy days, it might take 10 to 20 minutes, but the mechanism is the same. Indoor lighting, no matter how bright it seems, doesn't come close to matching the intensity and spectral quality of natural sunlight. Your brain evolved under the sky. That's the input it expects. This short, simple action, stepping outside soon after waking, has compounding effects. It sets your alertness rhythm, supports better sleep that night, improves mood regulation, and strengthens the prefrontal cortex capacity for focus and self-control. It becomes easier to resist distractions, follow through on plans, and build consistent habits, not because you're trying harder, but because your biology is aligned with the behavior you want to sustain. So the barrier is low, but the payoff is high. Just 5 to 10 minutes of morning light can flip the switch on systems that shape the trajectory of your entire day. Discipline doesn't start with motivation. It starts with a brain that's prepared to focus. One of the most essential and often overlooked tools for preparing the brain is morning sunlight. When you expose your eyes to natural light shortly after waking, you initiate a biological process that promotes what neuroscientists call tonic alertness, a baseline level of wakefulness and focus that persists throughout the day. This isn't about being hyperstimulated or over-caffeinated. It's about setting the conditions for sustained mental clarity, calm focus, and the ability to consistently follow through on habits and decisions. Tonic alertness is different from the kind of acute alertness you might experience during a moment of stress or excitement. Those bursts are short-lived and deplete your system. Tonic alertness, on the other hand, is like a steady hum in the background of your brain. It gives you access to consistent attention, better emotional regulation, and improved cognitive control. And morning light is one of the most effective ways to activate and stabilize that state. Here's how it works. When natural light, particularly rich in blue wavelengths, hits the retina, it activates a specific class of light-sensitive cells that send a signal to the brain's master clock in the hypothalamus, called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, SCN. This input tells the SCN that the day has begun. In response, the brain coordinates a release of wake-promoting neurochemicals, including cortisol, norepinephrine, and dopamine. These neurochemicals elevate your baseline level of arousal, not in a jittery way, but in a focused, steady way that prepares the brain for learning, decision-making, and behavioral consistency. This state of tonic alertness is especially important for habit formation. In order to build and maintain a habit, you need the cognitive resources to stay attentive, make deliberate choices, and resist competing impulses. All of that is governed by circuits in the prefrontal cortex, the brain's control center for goal-directed behavior. When your baseline alertness is low, the prefrontal cortex struggles. Distractions become more attractive. Habits don't stick. Willpower drains quickly. But when you regularly expose yourself to morning light, your brain learns to expect and sustain this alert state earlier in the day. Over time, this anchors your mental energy and attention during the hours when you're most likely to engage in productive behaviors. You start the day with your foot on the gas. Not because you're forcing it, but because your neurobiology is primed for forward momentum. The practical implication is simple but profound. By stepping outside and getting natural light in your eyes within the first hour of waking, even for just 5 to 15 minutes, you promote a biological foundation that supports discipline. You're not just waking up, you're programming your brain to stay engaged, resist distractions, and return to your goals over and over. Tonic alertness becomes your default setting, and once that's in place, the effort it takes to stick with habits drops significantly. The brain is no longer fighting itself. It's aligned, and when the brain is aligned, discipline becomes automatic. Over weeks and months of consistent morning light exposure, the brain undergoes a profound shift in how it evaluates rewards and pursues goals. At the heart of this transformation is a recalibration of the dopamine system. In a state of chronic light deprivation or erratic light exposure, dopamine release becomes tied to sharp, unpredictable spikes, often triggered by immediate gratifications like sugary foods, social media notifications, or novelty searches. These phasic bursts reinforce short-term thinking. I need a quick hit now, your brain insists. But regular morning light establishes a steady, tonic dopamine tone. That baseline elevation favors sustained motivation rather than momentary pleasure, encouraging neural circuits to favor behaviors that pay dividends over days, weeks, and months rather than fleeting seconds. This shift is supported by neuroplastic changes in two key brain regions, the nucleus accumbens and the prefrontal cortex. The nucleus accumbens, part of the brain's reward hub, becomes less reactive to trivial stimuli and more responsive to cues associated with meaningful long-term outcomes. Simultaneously, the prefrontal cortex, your executive control center, strengthens its connections with the accumbens and the dorsal striatum, a region critical for habit execution. These reinforced pathways allow you to envision future rewards more concretely and act on them with less internal debate. Instead of impulsively checking your phone, you're guided by an internal narrative of progress toward larger objectives. As these circuits reorganize, your perception of effort also transforms. Tasks that once felt burdensome now carry an intrinsic sense of purpose. That's because the act of pursuing a long-term goal itself becomes rewarding. Synapses in your prefrontal cortex fire more reliably when you engage in planning and sustained action, releasing modest but steady streams of dopamine that reinforce the behavior. Over time, this positive feedback loop, rooted in early light exposure, conditions your brain to prefer delayed gratification. You start to find satisfaction in the incremental steps toward a project, a fitness milestone, or a creative endeavor, rather than in the fleeting highs of distractions. Crucially, this rewiring doesn't rely on willpower alone. Willpower is a finite resource, but the neurochemical landscape shaped by morning light is self-sustaining. As your circadian clock aligns and your neurochemistry steadies, the prefrontal circuits continue to grow stronger even when you face stress or fatigue. Challenges no longer hijack your impulses as easily because the default mode of your brain has shifted toward long-term plan. You no longer need to override counterproductive urges. The urges themselves diminish in intensity and frequency. Ultimately, this habit creates a brain that instinctively values what will matter most. By anchoring your daily rhythm to natural light, you coax your neural networks into a configuration that prizes perseverance and strategic thinking. Instant gratifications lose their pull, not because you're depriving yourself, but because your brain has learned that the deeper rewards of sustained effort are more satisfying. In this way, a simple 5-10 minute ritual of morning light becomes the catalyst for a profound realignment of priorities, rewiring your brain to seek long-term goals over short-term rewards, day after disciplined day. Discipline is often thought of as a battle of willpower, a constant struggle to push yourself forward against resistance. But what if discipline didn't have to be a struggle at all? What if discipline could become automatic, effortless even? This happens when your biology is properly aligned with your behavior. When the internal rhythms of your brain and body are synchronized with the actions you want to take, the need for conscious effort diminishes dramatically. Instead of forcing yourself to act, your system naturally drives you toward consistent, goal-directed behavior. The foundation of this alignment lies in the brain's intricate communication between the prefrontal cortex, the basal ganglia, and the neurochemical milieu shaped by your circadian system. The prefrontal cortex is your executive center, responsible for planning, decision-making, and impulse control. The basal ganglia, particularly the dorsal striatum, manages habits and automatic behaviors. When these systems are in sync, behaviors that once required intense focus become habitual and automatic. Morning light exposure is a keystone habit in achieving this alignment. By delivering a potent signal to your brain's master clock, it orchestrates the release of neurochemicals like cortisol and dopamine at optimal times. Cortisol primes alertness and cognitive readiness. Dopamine sustains motivation and reward signaling. Together, they create a neurochemical environment where the prefrontal cortex can effectively regulate impulses and the basal ganglia can consolidate new habits. As you consistently expose yourself to morning light, your circadian rhythms stabilize. This stabilization enhances the timing and efficiency of neurotransmitter release. The result is that your brain's reward and control centers operate in harmony rather than in conflict. When your biology is aligned this way, the effort required to initiate and maintain disciplined actions decreases. Tasks that previously felt daunting begin to feel manageable or even natural. This biological behavioral synchrony also strengthens neural pathways that support long-term goal pursuit. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself, favors repetition within an optimized biological context. Over time, the circuits linking motivation, habit, and executive function become more robust. This means that discipline isn't just a momentary choice, it becomes a default operating mode. Your brain begins to anticipate and prepare for the behaviors that align with your goals, reducing friction and internal conflict. Importantly, this automatic discipline doesn't imply mindlessness. Rather, it reflects a brain operating at peak efficiency, where conscious intention and habitual action are seamlessly integrated. You retain the capacity for flexible decision-making, but no longer expend excessive energy overcoming resistance. In summary, discipline emerges naturally when your internal biological rhythms and neurochemical states are in tune with the behaviors you want to embody. By cultivating habits that anchor and synchronize your circadian system, such as morning light exposure, you create the conditions for effortless consistency. In this state, discipline is no longer an uphill battle. It becomes the path of least resistance, driven by your biology's alignment with your intention. When your biology and behavior are aligned, discipline transforms from a daily struggle into an effortless rhythm. It's no longer about forcing yourself to act, but about creating the internal conditions that naturally guide you toward your goals. By embracing simple, consistent habits like morning light exposure, you harness the brain's powerful capacity to rewire itself, strengthen focus, and sustain motivation. This alignment empowers you to move beyond fleeting willpower and step into a state of unstoppable discipline where progress becomes inevitable and lasting.